Good morning, friendship. Let me hear your horns. Folks, I am just so thankful that you're here. This is a Mother's Day unlike any Mother's Day that has ever been celebrated in the history of the church in the United States of America. This is the first time for weeks that the body of the church has not been able to meet inside the building. And so we come today to truly honor our mothers, but above all that, to honor God. You have seen the film crew that is here. That is Jeff Stephen and his productions from Jackson. This is going to be filmed and it's going to be put on, of course, our Facebook and YouTube and some other sources. And so, while he was trying to film you inside your car, I hope you were awake. This past week, I have been on 4 different webinars in just 1 week. One of the webinars had over 250,000 people on it. In fact, about halfway through, we were notified that 1 million people in South Korea had just tuned in. A friend of mine who was one of my interpreters many years ago, Dr. Billy Kim, who pastored a great church in Korea, had just notified 1 million Christians in South Korea to turn into the webinar that I was watching. And so for that one, we had about 1,250,000 people watching that and hearing the gospel of Christ. But then later on in the week, I was on another webinar with about 500 pastors from here in Tennessee, along with the governor of our great state. And the governor was thanking all the pastors for what we have been doing and are trying to do during this pandemic. And let me tell you folks, it was so good to hear our governor ask for permission to pray for us as pastors. Of course, we granted that. And Governor Lee prayed a beautiful prayer. He said, "Gentlemen, before I am the governor of Tennessee, I am first and foremost a Christian." And isn't that good to know? That we have a man who unapologetically in the State House says, "I'm a Christian before I'm anything else." And then he prayed for us as pastors before we had a chance to pray for him. I have thought much about the conference calls, the Zoom meetings, the webinars, and all that I have been involved in these past several weeks. I've given it a lot of thought. Many of the conferences have dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic. Many have pertained to the payroll protection plan that we know as PPP. And by the way, our church applied for that and we received a loan, which is helping tremendously, and thousands of other churches have done the same. Many of my calls have related to procedures and details which relate to going back into our building. You probably can't begin to imagine all the little tiny details that have to be addressed or need to be addressed before we walk in to the church building. And I have said to hundreds of pastors these last few weeks, and of course they all know it, the building is not the church. I am looking at the church this morning. We are the church. The building is where the church gathers. So whether we meet in a parking lot or in a building or by webinars or by Facebook, where 2 or 3 are gathered in His name, He is there. And so I have gone over page after page after page of little details that have to address for your sake and your safety before we come back together. Out of all the hours that I have listened and watched and shared with other people, I've come away with one thing that I want to share with you this morning. It's not going to come as a surprise to you, but in all of these weeks of not being able to meet as a body, in all of these weeks of having to share with literally thousands of people by now, one thought has continually come back to my mind. And you find it in Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 2. Are you ready to read it? Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 2. "O Lord, I have heard your speech, and I was afraid. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known, and in your wrath, remember mercy." If anything should be learned because of this pandemic that we've been going through, this disease that has swept our planet, is that we have heard the voice of God. For those of us who are Christians particularly, we've heard the voice of God, not from some thundering sound on Mount Sinai, but we've heard the voice of God through a silent whisper from a microscopic world that cannot be seen with the naked eye. Our greatest need today in our nation is not a cure for the pandemic virus, this coronavirus that we're facing. The greatest need today in America and the nation and the world is for revival to once again sweep through our churches. We need an awakening among those who call themselves Christians. It's true because in many of our churches and pastors I have been talking with, many churches today are powerless, and they're weak, and they're ineffective. That's not to be critical. That just comes from a listening ear to having heard hundreds and hundreds of pastors whose names I don't know, whose faces I couldn't see, but I was listening to them as we were all sharing, listening to their hearts. Many churches are helpless today because they are hopeless. Thank God, Friendship Baptist Church has not given up, and we will not give up. But there are many churches out there today, because of one reason or another, have basically thrown in the towel. They've raised the white flag of surrender. Many have replaced faith with fear, and they're walking in fear rather than in faith. Many have replaced action with doubt. I heard this past week that of the over 46,000 Southern Baptist churches that we have, and that's a good bragging number, of the 46,000 Southern Baptist churches, 75% are declining. And that means that they're either dying or they're already dead. And if that's the truth, they're dying of a spiritual pandemic. What we need in our churches is genuine heaven-sent revival. And it needs to start here in our church in Friendship, Tennessee. We do not need another Protestant Reformation. We've had that hundreds of years ago. We need a Christ-centered transformation in our world. We need a spiritual awakening. It needs to start in Crockett County. It needs to spread to West Tennessee. It needs to go all over our state. It needs to go all over our nation and all over the world. A spiritual awakening. We need millions of hell-bound sinners to come to Christ. My heart has been burdened these last several weeks when we have not been together for this community as never before. There are so many people living in Crockett County who are lost. They're without Christ and they're without hope. And you know their names. You farm with them, you work with them, you shop with them, you know them by name, but sometimes you have never even opened your mouth and told them about Jesus. And if there's one thing this pandemic has told us and taught us, life is very, very fragile. Going to church does not make us a Christian. I had a man not tell me long ago, he said, I'm a Christian. I said, good. How do you know you are? He said, I was raised in church. You can be in church every Sunday and be lost. You can go to a Christian university and be lost. The only thing that makes one a Christian is if you have answered the question in a positive way, have you been born again? And the answer has to be yes. If this worldwide pandemic has taught us anything, it should be that we as believers should wake up, get up, and speak up for the cause of Christ. We must open our mouths and tell others that Christ is the only hope for the world. Now listen to me carefully. Doctors and nurses cannot save us. They're trying. Our daughter-in-law, Lisa, has just returned Friday from 3 weeks in Detroit, Michigan. She and a few other nurses in Memphis were selected and asked to go to Detroit into a hospital there that is ground zero for Detroit. New York City gets all the publicity, but Detroit, Michigan was hit as hard, if not harder, than New York. And to hear her stories, that I will not relate this morning for time reason and for very graphic detail, but to hear her talk about what she has seen for the past 3 weeks in a hospital so lined with people dying and they can't do anything about it. I will tell you this. She said she was walking down the corridor in the hospital where she was working 12 hours a day, sometimes 14 hours a day. And as she was walking down the hall, a man laying on a gurney reached out and grabbed her arm and screamed out, "Don't let me die! Don't let me die!" And Lisa said, "There's nothing I could do." She said, "I walked into a room by myself to cry for a moment, to get my composure and come back. People were dying and there was nothing they could do about it. Doctors and nurses are good. Thank God for those that are on the front line. Thank God for those in America who have not stopped working." I thought about the 18-wheelers. I saw them yesterday as I was having to go on a trip. The men and women who are driving those 18-wheelers, they're out there on the front line. They're putting their life on the line. But our doctors and nurses and people like that cannot save us. Vaccines cannot save us. Politicians certainly cannot save us. It's amazing what's happening in our nation's capital today. They have taken this thing that has killed millions of people around the world, and they're making a political football out of it. They can't save us. Denominations cannot save us. And my dear brothers and sisters, even the church cannot save us. Only the blood of Christ that was shed on the cross of Calvary can save us, and that's what the world needs. The greatest pandemic of all is not the coronavirus. The greatest pandemic of all is called sin. And unless we do something about it, unless we share the good news, people are going to die and spend eternity in hell. That's the greatest threat of all mankind today. The greatest need of the hour is for our churches to wake up, and for revival to sweep through our churches, and for spiritual awakening to sweep through our land. We do not need to return to normal. There's a new phrase going around today among pastors especially. It's called the new normal. And hopefully it will unfold in the weeks and months to come. We have fallen asleep, I'm afraid, at the foot of the cross, and it is time to wake up. It must not be business as usual any longer. Hopefully we have learned that. It is time for churches, and even our church, to go on what I call a spiritual diet. There may be some things we're doing in our church that we don't need to do any longer. There's some things we need to start doing. One in particular is we need to reach Crockett County for Jesus. And this pandemic should have taught us that. The old-time religion in our country has been replaced with what a pastor called the showtime religion. And I said, I agree with you. I think it's time for us to get back to the old-time religion. I think it's time for us to get back to just preaching the Word as it is. The songs that feed our heart, the messages that feed our heart, getting back to the basics. If we don't do that, who's going to do it? Let me say to you out of love, it's time for revival at Friendship. Now, this is Mother's Day, and I want to address mothers for just a moment. So turn to Proverbs chapter 31. You probably already know this passage. It is the favorite passage for mothers, or at least for me. It gets right to the point. But if you'll turn to Proverbs chapter 31, and if you will go to verse 30, this sums up what I want to say. And this is for all the mothers. Proverbs 31, verse 30. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. You can put in parentheses there, a mother. Let's put that there. But a mother who fears the Lord is to be praised. And verses 10 through 30 describe a godly woman and or a godly mother. And I say to you again, you've heard me say it before, you don't have to have children to have a family. You and God make a family. You understand that, don't you? You're part of the family of God if you're a Christian. And if you're married and you don't have children, you're still a family. This is about the godly woman and godly mother. Look at verse 10, and we're going to go right through some words in those verses. You can write them down or just remember them, or go to Facebook and see them later on. A godly woman in verse 10 is virtuous. That means she's decent. She's a decent woman. Verse 11 describes her as someone you can trust. That means a godly mother, a godly woman is dependable. Isn't it nice to know that some people are dependable and they're good for their word? Verse 12 uses the word good to describe a godly woman. That means she is devoted. She is totally devoted to God and to her family. Nothing sways her from that. She stays on course. Verse 13 says she works. That means she's diligent. For all of you dear mothers who work outside the home, that's a job. If you work inside the home, that's a job. If you don't have to work outside the home, dear ladies, don't ever apologize for being, quote, just a housewife. There's no such thing as just a housewife if you do it right. So it tells us she's diligent. Verse 14 uses the word brings. You see that word brings? That means she's discerning. People can't fool her. She can see right through you. It's amazing how our mothers could see right through us when we were children. Remember that? You never can fool a mother. You might be able to fool your dad, but you just can't fool your mother. She can see through us. Verse 15 says she rises while it's yet dark. She takes care of the needs of her household. The word here is disciplined. She's a disciplined lady. Verse 16 says she considers a field and she buys it. That means she's deliberate. She doesn't waste her money. She knows how to use the coupons. She knows where to get the bargains. She knows how to save the family some money. Verse 17 says she strengthens. That means she's delightful. The word strengthen here is a term for being basically physically in shape. She takes care of how she looks. Verse 18 through 19 says she perceives. That means she's determined. She is determined that nothing will sway her from being a godly wife and a godly mother. Verse 20 talks about she uses her hands. She's demonstrative. She demonstrates her love for people. One thing about Friendship Baptist Church, not just for the women, but for the men as well, our church is a demonstrative church. We care for people in this community. I brag about this church so many times to so many people that when people in this community have a need and we know it, we do our best to help. A godly woman does the same. Verse 21 says she's not afraid. She's not afraid. She doesn't live in fear. She doesn't wake up every morning singing gloom, despair, and agony on me. She doesn't sing that song. She wakes up in the morning and says, oh God, thank you for this day. The word here is disposed. She is disposed to doing what is good. Verse 22 through 25 uses the word honor. That means she's distinguished. When people hear her name, they think, that's a godly woman. That's a good woman. She's a great mother. She's a great wife. She's distinguished. Verses 26 and 27 talks about a woman of wisdom. That means she's diplomatic. I can deeply appreciate people who are diplomatic. People like that can handle situations without losing their cool. I admire people like that. People who are diplomatic can put you in their place and you still love them. Isn't that amazing? A mother can put us in our place and we still love her. Verse 28 says she's blessed. That means she is deserving of blessings. I was hearing the other day about an individual who passed away recently. And they were talking about what a great person this individual was and all the good things this individual had done. And the truth was, none of it was true. None of it was true. A godly mother and a godly woman is deserving. Her life speaks for itself. And then verses 29 and 31, do you see that? They use the word excel. She excels. Others have done good, but you excel. The word here is divine. That means she radiates the love of God in her life. Think back about your mother. Now, if your mother is still alive, I'm sure you're going to call her today or maybe be with her. But think about your own mom. One day when the Lord returns, I can't prove this, but I have the feeling when the books are open, Jesus Christ is going to turn to this page, Proverbs 31, and He's going to call this lady by name because we don't know her name. Charm is deceitful, beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. But one thing we do know, she was probably called Mother. She was not perfect, but she had a perfect heart toward God. She, like most mothers, was what I call the morning and evening star for her children. Most mothers, even though they don't recognize it, they have the imprint of heaven on their faces. Their angelic smile comforts a child. Their watchful eyes look over a babe that's sleeping at night. And a mother will stay up all night long with a child that has a fever and not go to sleep at all to take care of the one that she loves. A mother's love transcends all the emotions of the heart. Now, we as dads love our children and our grandchildren and maybe great-grandchildren, but mothers love in a different way. That's the way God made women. A mother's love is not stifled by selfishness. It is not daunted by danger and is not weakened by worthlessness. And a mother, whether her children experience fame and fortune or disgrace and poverty, she will always love her children. Now listen to me carefully. It doesn't mean she will condone their behavior. A godly mother will not do that. A godly mother or a godly father will not enable their children to continue to live a sinful lifestyle, but they will always love their children. And if all the world should cast them off, a mother becomes all the world to them. Now, many of us today have mothers who have gone on to glory. They're with the Lord. We have two of our grandchildren here with us this week. And yesterday, little Levi said, "Papa, where's your daddy?" And I said, "Well, he's with the Lord." And he says, "Where's your mother?" And I said, "She's with the Lord." He said, "That's good, isn't it?" Only a child thinks, that's good, that's very good. But we miss our mothers, don't we? We miss those private prayers that they prayed for us. After I married and we moved away, and I'd call home, and I'd talk to Dad and Mom. Mother would always say, "Hon, we've been praying for you today." I miss the prayers of my mother. There are no more sacred spots on earth than where our mothers were committed back to earth. While their spirit is with the Lord, if they were Christians, their mortal remains await the resurrection morning. And they wait in that little waiting room we call the grave. And in that grave there rest the remains of the one who nursed us in our infancy, taught us in our childhood, counseled us in our youth, and watched us as we left her home to begin our own home. Now, you know, when we leave our home to go out into the world, whether it's off to school or to get married, I'm sure secretly Mom and Dad will often go, "Whew, the house is empty, it's quiet. Thank the Lord they're gone," for a while. But then a mother begins to ponder those things, and that quietness sets in. There's nothing so loud as a quiet room. We all know that. And a mother ponders those things. It said about Mother Mary, the mother of Jesus, she pondered the things that Jesus did. Mothers do that. Thank God for godly mothers. Her prayers and her influence are always woven, ever woven into our DNA. We can't get away from it. Her fervent prayer never leaves us, and we look forward to that day when we can be with her once again on that eternal shore in the presence of our Savior. Now, moms, let me say to you, even though I can't see you, I'm just looking through your windshields, but even though I can't see you, let me say to all the moms and all the mothers, the greatest gift you will ever give your husband and the greatest gift you will ever give your children is to give your husband a godly wife and to give your children a godly mother. That's the greatest gift of all. It doesn't matter how much you make, what size house you live in, but it does matter how much you love them and have you led your children to Christ. Your children will remember your prayers long after everything else is gone. Thank God for godly mothers. God bless the mothers who have led their children to know Christ as Lord and Savior. So remember these words: charm is deceitful and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. We thank God for our godly mothers.